Hello, you're watching a Reality Check Facebook Live from BBC News. I'm Anthony Rubin and I'm here in the BBC newsroom with Reality Check correspondent Chris Morris. We've had Prime Minister Theresa May updating the House of Commons this afternoon on what happened in the meeting of EU leaders last week. So Chris, let's start with that. What did we find out?
Yeah, I mean, this is a routine thing she does every time she's been to a European summit, a European Council as it calls. She comes back to Parliament the following Monday and says, here's what's happened, and then Labour and the SNP and others throw questions at her saying, well, it was rubbish, wasn't it? And the Tories say it was brilliant, wasn't it? So we didn't learn an enormous amount that was new, but we do have the update of kind of where we've got to with a year to go until we're due to leave, and that is that parts of the withdrawal agreement are now done. The financial agreement or the divorce bill, we know, according to the government, that's going to be up to £39 billion, although there are still those in Brussels who think it could be a bit higher than that, and I can go into the detail of that if we need. The deal on citizens' rights, the rights of EU citizens here and about 1 million Brits elsewhere in Europe, that's pretty much done. But there are other things that aren't yet done. One of them is the Irish border. That's still got to be sorted out. And we haven't even started talks yet, they're due to start soon, on what the future relationship will look like, in particular the future relationship surrounding trade. So quite a lot's been done after a bit of a stuttering start to the negotiations, but there's a lot still to do.
So I'll be putting your questions to Chris, and you can ask a question by putting it in the comments section below. But I'll throw another one in now. So Chris, another thing that we heard about last week that we perhaps hadn't before was the what's going to happen with Gibraltar.
Yeah, now Gibraltar's a difficult one because, as we know, for 300 years plus since the early 18th century, there's been a dispute over sovereignty between Britain and Spain. Basically, Gibraltar was signed over to Britain and Spain has spent most of the next 300 years regretting that. What's been agreed by the other members of the European Union as the UK starts to leave is that any agreement in future between the EU and the UK on Gibraltar also has to be the subject of bilateral discussions between Spain and Britain. In other words, from the perspective of many people in Gibraltar, they're unhappy because it looks like it gives Spain, if you like, an extra veto over what happens in Gibraltar. So that's going to be an issue which has got to be dealt with in the next few months. And it was interesting that the language in the conclusions of last week's summit, the statement put out by the 27 leaders without the UK, slightly toughened up the language with reference to Gibraltar, saying Britain can't ignore this. And there are some issues on which Spain wants to have discussions. For example, the airport, which Spain says is built on illegally occupied land. It's not part of the land, they say, that was in the Treaty of Utrecht more than 300 years ago. There's also the status of Gibraltar's tax regime. Spain often refers to it as a tax haven. Gibraltar says it simply offers low tax to businesses because it wants to attract business to come in. So there are things, I think, that make people in Gibraltar very nervous. I was down in Gibraltar a couple of months ago, and they are worried about what Spain wants. I don't think we're going to see a dispute right away about sovereignty. I don't think the UK would allow that, but there are things which make people in Gibraltar a little bit nervous, and they're going to be keeping a very close eye on what happens. And it was notable in the House of Commons today, actually, Theresa May said, we will ensure, we're in close contact with the government of Gibraltar, and we will ensure that Gibraltar's rights are maintained.
Now we have some questions coming in. Tony asks, do UK people still have rights in the EU after we leave?
Well, some rights, it depends what rights you're talking about, really. I mean, yes, I mean, we still have diplomatic relations with those countries, and a lot of things are going to be, a lot of those relations are going to be very close. The rights are going to change. There's something called EU citizenship. It's kind of unofficial, but if you're a member, if you're a citizen of one of the 28 member states, as well as your national citizenship, which give you a passport, you also have certain other rights by being an EU citizen. That will go. There are some things which still have to be negotiated. One of the things, obviously, which a lot of people talk about is the health insurance card, the card that you get which can give you insurance when you travel abroad on holidays. It's not entirely clear yet for people who travel abroad how that will work in the future, and there are other things which have still got to be negotiated. So yes, of course there'll still be some rights, they don't simply disappear, but the relationship will change.
And we have a question from Danny, and Danny says, will the Irish border become the crux of these negotiations? An agreement could be met on everything else, but a hard border, which the UK can't accept, is seeming more and more likely.
I mean, Danny's right. I think it's one of the hardest single issues because trying to please everybody, and this appears to be impossible because the UK has said and the EU has said no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The UK has also said no kind of border checks, if you like, between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, if you like, a border along the Irish Sea. And yet it also said that there have to be ways if you want to have that border in Ireland completely open, invisible as it is at the moment. I was there last week, and you can just cross back and forward, as anyone who lives there knows, as many times as you like. Well, then you need not only no customs checks, you also need the same rules and regulations on things like food safety and animal welfare. A lot of the goods which cross the border thousands of times every day are things like sometimes live animals, but a lot of food produce. And if you don't have the same rules and regulations on how that food is manufactured, how the checks are done, then you would have to have checks at the border. And so it's going to be extremely difficult. It's interesting that talks have started on a pretty intensive basis in Brussels this week, involving the Brits, the Irish and the European Commission, to try and really nail down this issue of the Irish border. Danny's question was, could the whole thing fall apart on the Irish question? In theory, yes, it could, because both sides keep coming back to this mantra that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And so it does mean that a solution has to be found in Ireland that pleases everybody. A lot of people in Brussels and in other capitals think there's actually no way you can have an invisible border in Ireland unless some kind of customs union is maintained. Now, as we know, the UK says it's leaving the customs union. So can you form a new kind of customs partnership which maybe walks and talks a bit like a customs union but is called something else?
Thank you. You're watching a Reality Check Facebook Live from BBC News. I'm putting your questions about the state of the Brexit negotiations to Reality Check correspondent Chris Morris. And we have one here saying from Adrian, and Adrian says, is there government investment in rebuilding our global trade expertise to re-engage with all the many partners we turned our backs on for our relationship with the EU?
I don't think we turned our backs on people, but what happened for more than 40 years is that we didn't do our own trade negotiations, and that was a massive challenge within government, because if you suddenly need to prepare a department, and a new department had to be created, the Department for International Trade, we didn't have people with years and years of the very particular skill of negotiating an international trade agreement. So that department has had to be built from scratch, and for years we've relied on that happening in Brussels. So that has been a big challenge, and it is something that needs to be rebuilt. One thing we've now learnt, that in the transition period after Brexit, which is going to be 21 months long, if it gets agreed along with everything else, the UK will be able to negotiate and sign trade agreements, not actually implement them, with third countries around the world. That's one of, from the government's perspective, one of the big advantages they see from Brexit, and one of the reasons also that they want to leave the customs union. But is there a steep learning curve for people in trying to do trade negotiations? Yes, because we don't have that history of doing them. And I know that there was a UK delegation that went to Washington a few months ago, and people I know there were struck by the fact that on the UK side there were a lot of people with in-depth knowledge of doing trade negotiation, and in comparison the British delegation had very little experience. So it's something that's going to have to be learnt quickly.
Now, we've had a couple of questions about citizens' rights. John says, I'm a Brit married to an EU citizen. It's still unclear where her rights would be in the UK once we leave. And Glenn says, what if you have a UK passport and you're working in Europe? What will happen then?
Okay, citizens' rights, a lot of the basic agreement is now done in terms of saying what your rights are if you're already here, and what your rights are if you arrive between now and the end of the transition period. The big thing which is not yet clear is, if there's a problem, if there's a dispute, who gets to settle that dispute? In other words, who gets to govern it? What's the jurisdiction it's under? And of course that comes back to the very difficult issue of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. The EU side has been insisting that the European Court of Justice has to play a role in ensuring the rights of EU citizens here in the UK. And that's supposed to happen for several years after Brexit. But there are issues with the governance of the withdrawal agreement regarding citizens' rights which haven't yet been fully nailed down. And it's always going to be a difficult thing to do, because in the Brexit camp, retaining or regaining sovereignty over our laws and getting rid of the European Court of Justice has been a big thing. The trouble is, if you say the European Court of Justice has no role at all, either on a sort of primary basis or even on a secondary basis, it's very difficult to have any kind of relationship with the rest of the European Union. So some of those lines are going to have to be blurred. And I think for citizens there's a bit more clarity than there was a few months ago in terms of the rights you have now and how you're able to stay in the UK, or if you're based abroad, how you're able to stay in other countries. But there are still questions to be answered.
And Jay asks, he says, I voted to leave not for a transition period, which will no doubt last until the next general election. Theresa May needs to deliver and get us out now. So, Chris, why are we having a transition period?
A lot of people say, why haven't we left yet? And I guess, the answer to that is we could, in theory, simply repeal the legislation which took us in, and we would leave. The trouble is, it's not just about a piece of legislation, it's about all the rules and regulations that govern all aspects of our daily life. We need something to replace them, and if we left very suddenly, very abruptly, that's what people regard or talk about as the cliff edge. Why is there a transition period? Because if we did suddenly leave with nothing else in place for all sorts of things, people talk about, well, the planes would stop flying. In extremis, in extreme circumstances, that is possible if we didn't have an aviation safety agreement in place. It's highly unlikely, but it's not impossible. There are other things, for example, let me give you another example, the regulation of medicines. If we're not going to be a full member of the European Medicines Agency, then how do the medicines we go and buy at chemist shops and pharmacies, who decides whether those medicines are safe, who decides where they can be sold? The reason we haven't left immediately is because, whether you love the EU or you hate it, you have to accept that for 40 years we were kind of intertwined with all these rules and regulations, and unpicking it safely takes quite a bit of time. I think most businesses, not all, but most businesses are pretty happy that there's this transition period. The government likes to call it an implementation period, 21 months, because it gives them, and it gives governments, our government, but also governments on the other side of the channel, a bit more time to get ready. For example, if we're going to have new customs regulation, we don't yet know what the new customs arrangements are going to be, but if you are going to have suddenly thousands and thousands of more products going through customs regulations, well, you need the customs officers, you need the customs posts, and you can't simply produce them overnight. So that's one of the reasons why, I know some people who want to leave are frustrated by this, but that's one of the reasons why it's taking a little longer.
Now, Sarah says she thinks it's too bad they won't consider staying in the EU. Is that off the table?
Well, it's not entirely off the table. Both the main political parties say it's off the table, but until you're out, you're still in. And it's interesting that later this year there does have to be a vote in Parliament. A lot of people, there were demonstrations around the country over the weekend from people who want to stop Brexit, people calling for a second referendum. It seems to me that a second referendum is unlikely, but if Brexit were to be stopped anywhere, it would probably have to be in Parliament. There's going to be a vote probably later this year on whatever the withdrawal agreement is that Theresa May brings back from Brussels. What happens if Parliament votes that down? And we know she doesn't have a massive majority in Parliament. Interesting, as well as Theresa May talking in Parliament today, Keir Starmer, Labour's shadow Brexit secretary, gave a big speech today, marking, if you like, a year to go until Brexit's due to happen. And one of the things that he said in that speech, is now going to be Labour policy, is that if Parliament does vote down a withdrawal agreement, then the government's argument that means that if we don't agree with the withdrawal agreement, we just crash out anyway. That's not acceptable. He says, and he's going to try and get an amendment to the EU withdrawal bill specifying this, that if Parliament votes against the withdrawal agreement, then it's up to MPs in general, not just up to the government, but up to MPs in the House of Commons to decide what happens next. Is there a majority in the House of Commons for stopping Brexit? I suspect there probably isn't, but it's more of a battle about what kind of Brexit it is. Is it a hard one or a soft one?
Now, Steve says Brexit is the beginning. As we succeed without EU membership, others will follow. Any sign of moves in that direction, Chris?
No sign of anyone else planning to leave, to be honest. But the idea that there is Euroscepticism in other countries, yes, absolutely. It takes different forms in different countries. But I think Steve, wasn't it? I think Steve's right that if Brexit is shown to be a massive success, then people in other countries may start asking questions. That's one of the problems in the negotiations. Although they're saying this less than they were at the beginning of the process, I think it's pretty clear that other governments think we can't allow the UK to get too good a deal, because if they get too good a deal, then the Eurosceptics in our own countries are going to get strengthened. So I think it's become a problem in the negotiation that other countries have said whatever deal emerges, being outside the EU cannot be seen to be better than being inside. And so that's something which still has to be negotiated. At the moment, no sign any other countries are planning to follow suit and have a referendum and leave. But is Euroscepticism alive and well across the EU? Certainly it is, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for all your questions. You've been watching Reality Check Facebook Live from BBC News, and you can keep up to date with all the developments in the Brexit negotiations on the BBC News website and at bbc.co.uk/realitycheck.